just check with council whether there's any preliminaries that nothing matters to raise. Just signal, I'll be interested by the end of the day whether you think we're going to need the reply day that we set aside for the 3rd of March. So if you just confer and let us know, perhaps at least your preliminary views on that. That might not be able to be sorted until we've had next week's session, I don't know, but just to advise us whether we can vacate that day or not. We would appreciate some writing time on other matters if we can. Right, Mr. Hinchy, morning, and morning to, whoops, just let that motorbike go by. Welcome to the hearing, and we're in your hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We actually can't see you, so I'm not sure if we were supposed to be able to, but just to let you know that we can't.
No, we are the invisible hand.
Okay. That's reassuring in some form or another. I'm not sure what, but we'll just quickly introduce the team, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair, and then we'll get into our presentation. I might just hand over to Mr. Collins on behalf of the RBA to start that off.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. I'm John Collins from the Retirement Villages Association. We've got Matthew Brown and Taylor Beck from Ryman Healthcare, and John Kyle, who will also be talking to us and Luke will be covering the legal part of it. So if I just start with my statement of evidence, I'm John Nicholas Charles Collins. I'm the Executive Director of the Retirement Villages Association New Zealand Incorporated, or RVA. I was appointed Executive Director of the RBA in October 2007 and have now been in the industry for 15 years or more. I have considerable knowledge and understanding of the aged population and the retirement sector and its challenges. I presented evidence for the RBA in a number of planning processes, including the Christchurch Replacement District Plan and the Auckland Unitary Plan processes. We sought and successfully obtained bespoke planning provisions for retirement villages in those areas. This representation briefly sets the scene for our submissions, including the background to the RBA, the aged care and accommodation crisis, and what we need for the retirement village industry in the present process. The RBA is a voluntary industry association that represents the interests of the owners, developers and managers of registered retirement villages throughout New Zealand, with approximately 38,520 units that are home to around 50,000 older New Zealanders. The RBA's members include all 5 publicly listed companies: Ryman Healthcare, Somerset Group, Arvida Group, Oceania Healthcare and Radius Residential Care Limited, other corporate groups such as MetLife Care and Bupa Healthcare, independent operators and not-for-profit operators such as community trusts and religious and welfare organisations. The proportion of older people in our communities compared to the rest of the population is increasing rapidly. This is no exception for the Waikato, Waipā and Hamilton districts. Across these districts, the 75 plus population is expected to increase from 16,270 in 2018 to 47,140 in 2048. This is a 150% increase compared to the general population increase of 46 in those districts during this time period. As a result, the Hamilton, Waikato and Waipā districts are some of the fastest growing districts for retirement villages in the country. We expect the demand in the region will continue to grow as more people seek out the high quality care and amenities that retirement villages provide. The RBA's experience and data shows that demand for retirement villages is outstripping supply, and this trend will continue. RBA members are currently heavy users of RMA processes. Members rely on resource consents to authorise much needed retirement villages and their ongoing operational needs. However, as the RBA submission outlines, the RMA has caused a number of major challenges. Accordingly, the RBA and its members were greatly encouraged by the Resource Management Enabling Housing Supply and Other Matters Amendment Act 2021. We see the present process as a significant enabler of accelerating housing intensification for the ageing population. I note that the RBA is heavily engaged in intensification and streamlined planning processes across the country. We are seeking consistent provisions in all the Tier 1 councils, which we consider appropriate respond to the relevant statutory declarations. Consistency is very important for us for certainty and efficiency. I also note that the RBA has consulted heavily with its members to ensure the provisions we seek have unified support. In the Waikato region, the key outcome we seek is to accelerate housing intensification of the ageing population in a consistent and enabling regulatory framework which clearly responds to the needs of the ageing population and the unique features of retirement village activities. We also seek to remove undue planning restrictions which are needed to better reflect the government's housing intensification requirements. And these outcomes will be expanded on by Mr. Hinchley and Mr. Kyle. Luke.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Collins.
Mr. Chair, just on that, in terms of questions from the panel, I just wanted to check, would you like to ask questions of the team at the end of the presentations or after each person?
Well, we'll do it as we go if we see the need for it, and I'll just check to see whether there's anything on Mr. Collins.
No specific questions, but I think, Mr. Kyle, were you reading from something? It might be helpful if we did have a copy of the summary you prepared, because there was a lot of information in there, if that's possible.
Yep.
We understand that you are sending copies of those through, more or less as we speak. So.
They've been forwarded through this morning, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Well, if there's no questions, I'll pass over to Mr. Brown.
Right. Just a heads up for you as you do your presentations. I mean, obviously a key issue for us is to understand the legal argument as to why this is relevant to the legislation and to the task that we have in front of us. So we look forward to hearing that legal argument. All right. Mr. Brown, wherever you are.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Matthew Glenn Brown. I'm the General Manager for Development for New Zealand for Ryman Healthcare Limited. I've held this role since March 2020. I've also held similar previous roles with Ryman and other aged care providers for the past 12 years. I've prepared this statement to provide a brief overview of Ryman and our interests in the present process. Ryman is New Zealand's leading retirement village operator. Ryman was established in Christchurch in 1984 and now operates 38 retirement villages across New Zealand. Our villages provide homes for more than 13,200 elderly residents, and we employ over 6,700 people. Ryman is considered to be a pioneer in many aspects of the healthcare industry, including retirement, village design, standards of care, and staff education. Ryman is not a developer. Ryman is a resident-focused operator of retirement villages, committed to providing the highest quality housing and care for New Zealand's elderly residents in its villages. Ryman currently operates 2 comprehensive care retirement villages in the Waikato region, both in Hamilton City, with another under construction in Cambridge. Demand for our villages in the Waikato region is strong. Widely published population statistics referred to by Mr. Collins strongly support a growing need for further development of retirement villages and care. We have extensive experience in RMA planning and consenting processes. Many of our recent villages have been through notified resource consent processes. In those processes, the needs of our residents, the social and economic benefits of our villages, and functional and operational requirements for the layouts of our villages are not given sufficient attention. Instead, the focus has tended to be on the neighbouring resident amenity interests and concerns. We have also found that district plans around New Zealand are inconsistent and often poorly provide for retirement villages. These 2 factors have led to major delays in providing much needed housing and care. As with Mr. Collins for the RBA, Ryman is very encouraged by the new direction in the government's enabling housing legislation. We are hopeful that this process will allow the balance of considerations and consenting processes to be reset appropriately. This outcome will enable us to move more quickly on our housing projects and invest with greater certainty. Ryman agrees with and supports the key outcomes sought by the RBA, as previously set out by Mr. John Collins, and will soon be expanded on by Mr. Luke Hinchley and Mr. John Kyle. Happy to take questions. Otherwise, I'll be handing over to Luke Hinchley.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mr. Brown. not sure there are any questions, but perhaps I should just note that that at least two of the panel members are familiar with the obviously the planning issues around retirement villages, having sat on and determined a number of them. So you can be confident that we are at least aware of what the issues are. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Enchi, back to you.
Thank you, sir. So I've filed a legal submission on the 10th of February, so I wasn't intending to read that out in full, but I did want to touch on the overview section and then perhaps just address a couple of points on one of the key themes in this process around intensification.
Yep, thanks.
So if you've got a copy of my submissions in front of you there, I'm going to start from paragraph 5 and just work through that overarching statutory context.
Thank you.
It's important to acknowledge at the outset that the primary purpose of the present process is to address New Zealand's housing crisis. And as stated by the government in support of legislative reform for housing, New Zealand is facing a housing crisis, and increasing the housing supply is one of the key actions that the government can take to improve housing affordability. In terms of the RVA environment submissions, retirement housing is having its own unique crisis. Demand for retirement village accommodation is outstripping supply as more of our ageing population wish to live in retirement villages that provide purpose-built accommodation and care. Mr. Collins noted some of the key population statistics there and a significant growth in that 75 plus category. The ISPP has a narrow focus. It seeks to expedite the implementation of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. This, as Cabinet has said, is needed because the NPSUD is a powerful tool for improving housing supply in our highest growth areas. And the intensification enabled by the NPSUD needs to be brought forward and strengthened given the seriousness of the housing crisis, and this can be done by amending the RMA and the NPSUD ahead of the government's wider resource management reforms. A key outcome of the process is to enable housing acceleration by removing restrictive planning rules, and these restrictions are to be removed by the mandatory requirements, the new MDRS, and of course giving effect to Policy 3 of the NPSUD. As I've noted in paragraph 8, the force of these mandatory requirements is framed at the highest level as a duty on specified territorial authorities. In addition to the mandatory obligations, there are a range of other options for councils to enable housing acceleration, including by establishing new residential zones or amending existing ones, including additional objectives and policies to provide for matters of discretion to support the MDRS and providing more lenient density provisions. The councils can also impose restrictions in the vein of qualifying matters, but only where they meet the strict tests outlined. The ISPP process itself is intended to accelerate housing, and it does that by reducing timeframes, taking away normal RMA appeal rights on merits, and widening the legal scope for decision making, which I'm sure you'll hear more of during the course of the coming hearings. In my submission, it will be seen that this process is not about going through the usual motions of a Schedule 1 plan-making process, and it's certainly not about providing the bare minimum to respond to the various legislative steps. Rather, I submit the task ahead is a very important one. The IPIs and the ISPP are a means to solve an important national housing issue. We submit that the overarching legislative purposes, addressing New Zealand's housing crisis, accelerating housing supply, and removing planning restrictions should therefore resonate heavily in all of your decision making through the ISPP. And of course, you'll need to look at all the relevant statutory provisions carefully with that overarching purpose in mind. Turning then to theme 1, I won't read through all of this, Mr. Chair, but I just did want to emphasise that the theme report from the joint position of the councils, in my submission respectfully, misses the key point of the process, and that is to consider whether the plan changes appropriately enable the intensification that the legislation requires. So I have framed the questions in a different way, in the sense that paragraph 14.1 to the provisions achieve the statutory intent of enabling and promoting intensification. Do they apply Section 32 concepts appropriately? For example, are the IPA provisions effective and efficient? Are there other options for achieving those things? Have inappropriate planning restrictions been removed? And are the provisions fit for purpose for the housing activities that will need to deliver on the necessary housing needs? And I submit that those questions will flow through to a number of the later hearings. And then at paragraph 16, as highlighted by Mr. Kyle, in this case, and just picking up on the question you raised earlier, Mr. Chair, there is an important activity-specific sub-theme on intensification. The RVA and Ryman are tasked with accelerating housing intensification for an ageing demographic that has unique needs. The building and operation of retirement villages often require multiple approvals under district plans and regional plans, and the RVA and Ryman are therefore regular participants in these processes to ensure that activities can be practically undertaken. And they are applying that experience and the outcomes they've achieved in other cases to propose a regulatory framework which they say responds to the needs of an ageing population in the Waikato area, and Mr. Kyle addresses those in more detail. And in terms of the legal point as to whether and how, I suppose, this proposal from the RVA and Ryman fits in with the broader legislative requirements, that will be addressed in further detail in later hearings. I'd probably just say that from the industry's point of view, that retirement villages are essentially residential activities, and I don't think there's any debate about that. They have a number of residential units within them, and they essentially fit into the category of what would be described as a 4 or more residential unit type scenario or a multi-unit development scenario. So the proposition that the industry is seeking is to essentially provide for that activity class as a 4 or more, but in a more nuanced way that acknowledges the unique features of retirement villages. And we'll no doubt return to that in a further detail in subsequent hearings.
Right, thank you.
I wasn't going to touch on the other themes, perhaps just to point out that theme 2 in terms of policy 3, I've just noted that that is a separate obligation. It sits aside from the requirement to incorporate the medium density standards and needs to be looked at as a separate matter. I've addressed qualifying matters in theme 3, really just to say that there are a number of tests that have to be met in order for qualifying matters to be established, and we're respectfully asking the panel to carefully consider those relevant tests to ensure that there aren't qualifying matters in the plan which don't meet the requirements. And then we've just really touched on the other 2 themes at a broad level in themes 4 and 5. So that was all I was intending to say by way of opening presentation. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hinchy.
Morena, Mr. Hinchy. Just one, I know you're going to address this on scope later, but in terms of your paragraph 20, in that paragraph there's a sentence, the singling out of a specific policy within the NPSUD to be given effect to is submitted to be a very strong legislative direction. Just interested in whether in making that submission you're advising us that that singling out of that particular policy means that it's one that we should be giving greater weight to than the rest of the policies, or is it just a direction in terms of the timing, and in other words that policy 3 requires that these things happen earlier, or the process that we've got an IPI process? We've had submissions from other parties around that point, and just interested in your view on that.
I think just in terms of whether that ought to be given more weight, I think obviously whatever you do through this process, you must essentially give effect to that policy. So and that will be no doubt a matter of evidence and further legal submissions in terms of what that actually means. In terms of how that sits with the rest of the NPSUD, my submission would be that policy 3 can't be looked at in isolation, and you'll need to look at the wider context of the NPSUD and the other objectives and policies which essentially support policy 3. Mr. Kyle's mentioned a couple of those in his overview statement. He may wish to talk to those particular ones, but we will be, I guess, returning to you on this issue in terms of that wider context. But as I say, I don't think it necessarily is in isolation, and I probably wouldn't make a submission at this point that it should be given more weight than other provisions. But I will certainly reflect on that over the course of the next hearings.
Thank you.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a commonality amongst all council on that particular issue, so it's good to hear. Yeah. Anything else? No, that's fine. Thank you, Mr. Hinchey. So if you want to turn to Mr. Kyle, presumably.
I'll pass over to Mr. Kyle. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is John Kyle. I'm a resource management planning witness, and I'm obviously appearing on behalf of Ryman and the RVA. You should have a very brief statement of evidence from me, which reflects this introductory nature of the hearing. It's really just canvassing what the key issues are, as I understand it. So not a lot of detail about the RVA or Ryman's submission necessarily dealt with through my evidence, which is reflective of the phase at which we're at. I've got a brief exec summary in that evidence, which starts at paragraph 10. And I thought I might just briefly go over that and take you to a couple of other paragraphs in this statement, which reflect the question you just put to Mr. Hinchey, if that's okay.
Yep, thank you.
So at paragraph 10, I just sort of summarise the submissions that have been made by the RVA and Ryman, and the submissions seek to ensure that the district plans provide a consistent and enabling regulatory framework which responds to the needs of an ageing population within the Waikato, Waipā and Hamilton city districts. In paragraph 11, I've set out some population metrics there around the extent to which the population is ageing. That's really covered nicely by Mr. Collins, and so I don't think I need to necessarily go over that in any detail. He's given you quite a lot about the ageing population and the pressures that's creating for specific types of housing, particularly within
and from my point of view, that's not contentious, so fine.
Thank you. So at 11.2, you'll note that both the RVA and Ryman have sought to ensure that the council planning regimes are consistent with the requirements and expectations of the NPS UD and the Enabling Housing Act. And you'll note when you delve into the detail of the submissions that there are some aspects of the notified plan regimes that, certainly in the submitters' views, go beyond those requirements and expectations, leading to over-regulation or insufficiently clear regulation. And as Mr. Hinchey has mentioned, conformity with national direction and the Enabling Housing Act is considered to be a key issue in this hearing process. Turning to specifics, the RVA and Ryman consider that the notified planning regimes do not adequately provide for retirement villages, and that will be a key issue that we return to in evidence as this hearing process unfolds. Retirement villages are a specialist subset of multi-unit residential activity and therefore generally fit under the MDRS category of 4 or more residential units. However, the MDRS, with their focus on typical residential units, does not provide for retirement villages specifically, and the different specialist units and amenities in them particularly well. And for that reason, the RVA and Ryman have used the MDRS as a base for the relief they seek and adapted these provisions to ensure they appropriately account for the unique needs and features of retirement villages and their residents. The remainder of my exec summary just deals with the fact that it's highly desirable to have some consistency nationally with respect to provisions and plans with respect to retirement villages, because everywhere I've had any experience with consenting retirement village developments. There's quite a variety of approaches applied at various council levels and different levels of complexity. And whilst certainly from a planning point of view, I understand that each district and region is quite entitled to produce its own way. Yes, certainly some consistency around things like activity status and the way that plan provisions include performance standards with respect to retirement villages would be greatly helpful. So if I could just take you quickly to paragraphs, there's a couple of key matters I address in the evidence, I suppose. At paragraph 26, I've just got a few words there about objective 1, and I think this is quite an important backdrop, I suppose, or foundation for what Ryman and the RVA will come to tell you as the course of the hearing unfolds. But that objective specifically recognises the need for well-functioning urban environments that enable all people and communities to provide for their social, economic and cultural wellbeing, health and safety. Policy 1 also refers to well-functioning urban environments, which means enabling a variety of homes to meet the needs of different households. The panel will therefore need to consider the extent to which these and other NPSUD policies require district plans to specifically respond to the need to provide suitable and diverse housing choices and options for the ageing population as part of the intensification of urban environments. And just further down at paragraph 28, I just reflect a little bit on the NPSUD policy 3. And what I say there, that the submissions on this matter raise the question as to whether the intensification approach used by the councils has sufficiently recognised the need for older people to age in place. Traditional intensification models seek to locate density close to town centres and transport corridors, and that really feels like a trip back to planning school for me. In my opinion, this spatial approach does not always lend itself well to the broader need to provide for the health and social well-being of older people who benefit significantly from having access to housing and care options in their existing communities, close to existing family and social connections. Retirement village residents may have mobility constraints and are mostly no longer working. Hence, their need to access amenities via public transport or on foot or to employment centres is much lower than applies to others. So I just express my view there that a key issue for the panel to consider is how enabling intensification necessary for retirement villages should be provided for both in centres under Policy 3D and in other locations within the community. That's all I'd like to highlight from my evidence this morning, Commissioners, and I'm very happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Kyle. We'll just check Dave.
Thank you, Mr. Kyle. I just, in relation to the Waikato, I think earlier on, in paragraph 15, you talk about there are currently 14 retirement villages in Hamilton. Are there any sort of comprehensive retirement villages, if I can use that term, within Waikato and Waipā? If you know?
That's probably a question better addressed to Mr. Collins.
The question relating to comprehensive care or continuum of care villages, there are a number across the Waikato, Waipā and Hamilton district. I think there's 23 villages in total across the 3 districts, and many of those will be comprehensive care. Which ones are which off the top of my head, I'm not sure, but it is certainly a provision of the industry there.
Right, thank you. Back to you, Mr. Kyle, down to just the paragraph that you were referring to a minute ago, 28. My impression of like recently located and proposed retirement villages is that, you know, unless you get an opportunity like Ryman at Narrow Neck, which is close to where I live, or there's a new proposal at, by Somerset at Half Moon Bay. So there's an opportunity that's come up there for a very large piece of land within an existing residential area. So, you know, it's a very good opportunity to do exactly what you're saying here about, you know, putting a retirement village in within a community that's ageing and looking for it. But apart from those opportunities, I mean, you really are often forced to the periphery for land, you know, and that, I can see that doesn't fit with your desire to sort of basically put them anywhere within a community that might need it. You care to comment on that?
Yeah, that is a big challenge, as I understand it, for retirement village planning. And probably Mr. Brown can tell you some of the challenges that an operator like Ryman might experience in that space. But certainly my experience is, and it is predominantly with the Ryman approach, they are very vigilant in trying to find sites within communities rather than sort of force their facilities to the edge of urban areas. And look, in some cases that is what has to happen. You know, I can think of, say, Rangiora, for example, which is a small centre, but its site is on the fringe, and because it is a small centre, it's not too far from the middle of town or the community more generally. But in other cases, and I'm sure Mr. Brown will attest to this, Ryman does look for brownfield opportunities in the midst of existing communities, and yes, certainly is pretty active at looking for sites that might suit close to where that key demographic would want to live and stay connected with their community.
I mean, I understand the concept of age and place fairly well. If you're looking for a, and so retirement villages provide for that, that increasing level of care, but there's also needs that the village looks for beyond its boundaries. And in that respect, the location is quite important. And what I'm thinking of is that when you get a retirement village that's located sort of not close to a centre, virtually every single thing that an elderly person might want to access, they have to get in a vehicle for, as opposed to if you can have these villages in centres or in nodes. So I'm just sort of thinking about, I mean, I sense that RVA and Ryman are looking for provisions that would pretty much allow you to have a full opportunity for putting a village anywhere, and sort of leave it to you to decide. But is it not better to have villages that are close to what elderly people might want to access in the way of other medical services and community facilities?
Yeah, one point, and again, Mr. Brown might want to elaborate. Because people are older now when they're moving into retirement villages, they are far less mobile and far less able to participate in life outside of the village. So the village is specifically designed to cater for all their needs insofar as that can be achieved. And certainly the modern retirement village is very different to what used to be really just a residential centre for old people, which was the older form of concept. That they're have all the facilities under one roof, so to speak, so that people, because of their lack of mobility and their frailties, can simply live a fulsome life under that one roof, accessing most of the facilities they need day to day. Of course, there will be requirements to visit doctors and hospitals and things which necessitate somebody getting into a vehicle, probably. But yeah, the modern state-of-the-art version of retirement villages is very much reflecting the age and state of the residents that live there. I don't know if Mr. Brown wants to elaborate on that point, but I guess that the key issue there is that being close to family and the community from which these people have lived for a very long time, is a real key driver. Being able to sort of walk to the park or the shops, not so much.
You know, Mr. Kyle's covered it very well. I mean, that's the nature of our retirement villages now, is that we provide a level of amenity on site that covers most of what our residents need through normal course of their day. But we still are looking to be relatively close to amenities such as pharmacies and medical centres, and you know, some of those facilities that are can't be provided within the village, and independent residents, you know, are still shopping for themselves as well. So being close to supermarkets and things like that is still an advantage. But as John pointed out, most of the residents within the village are wanting to live somewhere that's close to their community, where they've, in most cases, they've been there for a very long time. Their networks of their social networks and their activity networks are all nearby, and they generally prefer to keep those networks close by when they move into a village.
Right, thank you. One last question. Mr. Kyle, in your consenting experience, I mean, putting aside things like, you know, earthworks or something like that, that you're probably not going to escape, irrespective of all these plan changes, but they'll be, you know, unless you really picked a site that's difficult, they'll be sort of minor things and manageable. What's sort of the key consenting requirement, or the key thing that is problematic in terms of the suitability of what you're proposing in the area that you've selected?
Yeah, one of the key issues is it's almost a where, say, a council processing plan, it might see the boundary, and I don't mean the boundary of the site, but the boundary of the issues that are relevant in any given set of circumstances. I think it's generally accepted that the effects of a retirement village on neighbouring properties and potentially on roading networks, that kind of thing, they are relevant considerations at the consenting phase. But some of the things that occur quite regularly in the processing of applications relate to things on the site and inside the retirement village itself. And you get a lot of particularly urban design comments, for example, which tend to suggest that the owner of the idea, if I can put it that way, isn't terribly well aware of the requirements of older people, and instead tend to apply more conventional urban design principles and requirements that might apply to somebody a lot less frail or a lot younger. And so there's a lot of internal matters that are brought to the table that need to be worked through, and I guess a general lack of regard for the specialist nature of the way retirement villages need to be designed, planned for and built. And in many ways, those things have got nothing to do with the external effects created by the village, yet you can spend months and months grappling with them and getting to a point where ultimately you can spend a lot of resources helping educate council officers to understand that what they're dealing with here is actually quite unique and different.
Okay. I guess in terms of bulk and height particularly, you would be looking for some of those issues to be solved by the introduction of the MDRS standards?
Yeah, to an extent, yes. The standards are pretty bold, aren't they? I mean, you've got to grapple with that. But the standards, I guess, set a new paradigm for residential development in Tier 1 urban environments in particular, and we all have to grapple with that. So I would think that this is an opportunity to be quite open-minded about how our retirement village developments might fit in with the expectations in that regard. I think generally though, what the RVA and Ryman seek via submissions is restricted discretionary activity status for retirement villages in all residential zones and some other zones as well, but with a clear focus on those external impacts, not matters that should best be left to the specialist in the field.
Thank you. No doubt there's lots of detail that will be got into at later hearings. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dave.
Morena, I've got a question for you, Mr. Kyle, but I've got a couple of questions that I might just put to either Mr. Brown or Mr. Collins first. Just wondering if there's a typical size or site requirement size that you need to accommodate a village, a more modern village, which you're talking about with all the facilities, and what sort of size we might be looking at. And then just at a broad level, what sort of facilities you talked before about trying to have facilities on site that meet the residents' day-to-day needs. What sort of facilities tend to be in the more modern villages that you're running?
I can answer that one, I think. So with respect to the first part of your question around size, so that largely depends on the area that it's in, the demographic of the area. You know, and probably some good examples. The site that we have under construction in Cambridge at the moment is that's an 8-hectare site. It's a single, made up of mostly single-level townhouses with a 2-level main building centred within the site, and that fits within the within the area that it's in. Comparing that to say a more dense urban environment, say in Takapuna, we have a site that's less than 2,000 square metres, where the height limits allow for multi-level buildings, and so that density can still be obtained through just more intense development of that site. With respect to the amenities on site, we provide a range of physical amenities and activities for residents. So within the site, there's common area lounges, there's restaurant, cafe, bar. We provide bowling greens at most of our sites, and they're regulation size. We also have activities rooms, gym, swimming pool, movie theatre, and as well as that, we have staff running daily activities programs to help keep our residents active and mobile as much as possible. So it's keeping people active and socially engaged is really important, and so that's the emphasis that we put on at the villages through running activity programs, through providing the amenities that enable them to maintain that part of their lives within the village.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, did you want to add anything to that, or yeah?
Mr. Collins, I think.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
Mr. Collins. Sorry, apologies. The wrong way.
Thanks for the opportunity. I think Mr. Brown's covered that very well. Ryman villages do tend to be larger. The average size of the village industry as a whole is around about 87 units. So some of them are significantly smaller. And we've seen them range from sites of a hectare or so right the way through to, I think the largest is 49 hectares just out of Levin. And they do adapt, the operator adapts their village to the community in which they are. The Orchards in Greytown, for example, is 2 blocks from the main street of Greytown, and the operator intends to encourage their operators to make use of the existing facilities in the town rather than duplicating them. So operators will build the village and work out what their community, the target community needs, and that fits in with that.
Mr. Collins, can I just follow that up, please? Is there I mean, scale, obviously, you've got Ryman's, Oceania and Somerset at the upper end of the scale. What's at the lower end of the scale? What's the sort of the minimum entry point, if you like, into the association?
It really depends quite a bit on who the operator is. There are not-for-profit villages which might consist of 15, 20, maybe 25 units around the back of the church, or it could well be an aged care facility which has a retirement village added to it, and that might be 20 or so units as well, right the way through to the scale that Mr. Brown talks about. It really does depend a lot on what the operator is able to purchase, to design, and what they can afford.
Yeah. I guess my question, which will be for later on, obviously, is we're talking quite a range here in terms of what the provisions that are will presumably will be sought from those obviously at the one end of the 15 to 20s that you're talking about, right up to the obviously several hundreds in the top ends. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So then just coming back to you, Mr. Kyle. So, and thank you to the previous 2 speakers. That was really helpful for my understanding in terms of the range and the sizes. In terms of the residential standards and the activities, and looking at the purpose of the residential standards to enable residential activities, what's your view in terms of what is the scope that we're looking at here? Would you agree that there's different effects associated with retirement villages to sort of standard residential units, the 3x3 that we're kind of looking at on under the MDRS? And I guess, it comes back to the scope argument, which we'll hear later, but just interested in your view in terms of the effects side of things.
Yeah, depending on the size of the village, but generally the effects of retirement villages, certainly, and I've had a look at plenty of them, post development and consenting and development, the effects are very low key. Because of the way the residents live, there's not a lot of traffic generation necessarily. There's not a whole lot of coming and going, and not too many noisy parties, and generally they're pretty quiet, sedate environments. Certainly some more conventional residential activities might differ in that sense, again depending on scale and form. But yeah, the level of activity is very much internalised. From the outside looking in, it's a very almost peaceful, tranquil location, which I guess reflects the nature of the lives of the people that are occurring inside the village.
So what is the key, I guess, effect in your view that would be different to a standard residential use on a site? Is it just a question of scale, or is it?
Yes, sometimes it is a question of scale. As Mr. Brown's highlighted, some of the villages need to occupy quite a bit of land to make them economic to build, and there's certainly some advantages in being able to provide comprehensive care on a relatively large site. But whilst a village like that might be quite large in form, externally its effects are quite low key by the way it's landscaped, by the way it's set back, and via the design of the buildings. Certainly in some instances you can have situations where retirement villages, particularly in more built up areas, you can present quite large building forms, and a good amount of care needs to be taken in the space of design, landscape setback and daylighting controls.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, do you mind if I just perhaps suggested a question be put to Mr. Brown on that point, because I think he may wish to just comment just in terms of the sort of functional and operational layouts of villages, which may to some extent differ from what you might see for typical residential housing, and perhaps just that we'll come to this in subsequent hearings, but I think if we're talking about it now, it might be just worth just highlighting a few points there.
All right, Mr. Brown, thank you.
Sure, yeah. So with respect to the layout of the village, and as John alluded to, you know, in an area where we might consider a townhouse type village, there's a lot of care and attention goes into designing the perimeter of those villages to fit into the surroundings. So that's where the setbacks, the landscaping, and the building design, careful consideration of all those elements is taken into account. And then what we tend to do with the main building, which is where the main building is what contains the care, some service departments, and all the village centre amenities, and that I spoke about earlier. So the lounge areas, the bar, restaurant, swimming pool, gym, library, beauty salon, those elements, hairdressers, they're all contained within the main building that we tend to locate centrally in the site. So by locating it centrally in the site, it is, from a massing point of view, it's a larger building, but located centrally means that it can be sort of separated from its surroundings by having a buffer zone of smaller, low-level residential units.
Thank you.
Just maybe one, sorry, Mr. Chairman, one other follow-up. In terms of that question about effects and some of the subtleties, I think Mr. Kyle talked to, I guess, the differences in terms of the internal requirements, and I guess one of the key features of the regime that the industry is putting forward, which we'll again deal with later on, is some adjustments to some of the internal amenity controls under the medium density residential standards. And Mr. Kyle may just want to comment, I suppose, on the subtleties here, just to sort of again leave that in your minds for later.
Yeah, certainly things like outdoor living spaces or outlook spaces, if they're required on a unit by unit basis, that just doesn't have any practical use. Those types of requirements don't have any practical use in a retirement village situation, where most of the facilities that people enjoy are centralised or set out in a way which you know, helps them interact and helps them stay active. So yeah, those types of things you can, you know, stump up to a council with a plan for a retirement village, and the council plan will run the ruler over it and say, where's your outdoor living space or your outlook space, and it yeah, that can prove to be a challenging thing to get over.
All right, Michael.
I have a question for Mr. Brown and or Mr. Kyle relating to wastewater and water infrastructure, particularly in Hamilton City, whether you've given any thought to, or whether you will, in terms of the ongoing process, in terms of meeting Hamilton City's stated concerns about the uncertainty in the demand for increased infrastructure in a geographic area. So it seems that you're asking for sort of general relief and probably can't sort of sit down and look at particular areas. Can you perhaps comment on that?
I guess the only comment that I'll make is, and before I flick this over to Mr. Brown, is that these issues are worked through very extensively on a case-by-case basis when villages are in the consenting phase, and it's very much a horses for courses approach, respecting the local conditions.
Yeah, so just to add to that, we rely heavily on our civil and infrastructure consulting engineers, but I guess from a demand point of view, for the area taken, our demand is generally lower than a standard residential unit within the same area for water supply and wastewater. With respect to stormwater, that's an area that we really focus on. And it is, as John said, it's a horses for courses approach, but more often than not, we're looking at systems that allow for retention or detention of stormwater on our site so that it can be then released at rates that meet the requirements of the local area.
Yes, well, thanks for that. So, yeah, the key point then is really perhaps the overall density means that the demand's not going to be more than typical residential.
That's
and
right.
That's because you've got, say, if you've got, thinking about some in Auckland, is Ryman, is that the Hillary, is that a Ryman one? It's multi-storey blocks, but then you've got lots of open land in between. So overall that density is no higher than typical residential. That's what you're saying?
That's right, yes.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
And just on that one, if you don't mind me interrupting, I mean, it is a bit of a key theme across these councils and other councils around the country in terms of infrastructure. And of course, councils are understandably concerned about how they're going to provide all this extra infrastructure to accommodate all this intensification. And I don't think the industry submits that that's inappropriate at all. Of course it is. I think the main submission point is to have a constraint or a consideration in a consent process which looks at that issue, but that it doesn't actually prevent development going ahead. Because I think what Mr. Brown is saying, and again, this is my experience, is that there's often solutions, partly maybe because the demand characteristics are different, or that there's quite a bit of innovation available when you've got a very large site and a sophisticated operator and developer to come up with something which will work despite what the general constraint in the system might look like.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. My only, it's more of a flag, I think, Mr. Kyle and Mr. Hinchy on this one. I'm looking at your paragraph 34, Mr. Kyle, where you've contended that the submission doesn't fall within the out-of-scope theme. Obviously, we'll determine in due course what our view is with respect to scope on this matter, but I guess just to flag that you might also want to contemplate when you come before us next time that it might be a matter arising which is out of scope but that we can address. So you might just want to cover that issue off in due course, just in the event that we don't make a determination on scope issues in advance. So I say more of a flag than anything else at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we are certainly thinking about that scope point. We probably don't have a good understanding of where the council's coming from on that as yet, because it's a fairly general point they've made on that front. But I think, as support what Mr. Kyle said, is that we think there is a scope avenue for the industry submission. We'll come back to you on that, but we'd certainly be keen to understand where the council's coming from as well.
All right, thank you. I think that's and we're done for the moment. Thank you, Mr. Hinchy and colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. We'll see you again soon, no doubt.
You will, yes.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Right, okay.
Good morning. Thank you, Commissioner Hill, members of the panel.
Right, we're in your hands.
Thank you, sir. I'm here today presenting on behalf of Ms Noakes. I have filed some legal submissions and opening statement. I've just checked that you've received those and have had an opportunity to read them.
We have on both counts, thank you.
Thank you. So my intention in presenting today is to briefly introduce Ms Noakes and her case. And then just to say that I have watched and caught up on the live stream the discussions that the panel has had with various council regarding the urban fringe matter. And so I want to comment on that as well. I think things have perhaps moved on somewhat from what I had in my legal submission, so I think it will probably be better to have a discussion about that and engage in questions when I get to that point in time.
Right.
But in terms of Ms Noakes' interest in the proceedings, it is actually relatively confined. She is a submitter just on variation 3, and her interests are confined really to stormwater management issues. Geographically, Ms Noakes' property is the urban edge of Pokeno. She is a rural property, and that property receives stormwater from attenuation ponds from the Pokeno Village development, and she is also adjacent to a part of the Havelock Village precinct land, which is yet to be developed. So she has concerns regarding stormwater and what's already occurring there, and we heard yesterday that there are already stormwater issues in Pokeno, and she is concerned with the potential for further intensification as proposed under the MDRS to exacerbate those problems. Now that's largely a technical matter. The appropriate place for dealing with that and evidence on that will be in the substantive hearings to be held in the middle of the year. And so Ms Noakes wished to be involved in a strategic issues hearing, really in relation to the urban fringe matter. And so, as you know, what's occurred there is that Ms Noakes has supported that, and she would want it to be retained because that urban fringe matter has the ability to also assist with the stormwater concerns that Ms Noakes had. So, however, what's happened with the council's change of position has made that become a somewhat more complicated issue. I mean, my intention today had really been to reiterate the point that in terms of whatever happens next with that, it needs to be done in a timely way so that submitters can participate in that properly. And that was the point that I made in my written submission. But it appears to have got a little bit more complex than that based on the discussion yesterday and the advice from the council that in terms of what happens next, it probably can't be done in a timely way, or it can't be done until the Section 42A report that will occur probably in June, based on those draft discussions on timetabling that were discussed yesterday. So it's really how do we deal with that in a fair way from here is what I wanted to raise with the commissioners. So in terms of what the council had to say yesterday, I mean, the council have said that they haven't gone as far as saying that they think it's unlawful, whereas the other submitters have in terms of that qualifying matter, but what they have said is they won't be calling evidence because they don't think that their legal and planning advice that it doesn't meet the tests for a qualifying matter in terms of the Enabling Housing Act. And so that really does put, I think, submitters coming to the situation, to the proceedings in quite a difficult position, because the usual situation that you have with a plan change, and I don't think there's any difference in the IPI, is that it is for the council to put forward a plan change or a proposal, and the submitters then come to that and debate that. Now, the council has said it may need to look at what fills that void. Where do we go next? And they've acknowledged that they didn't really think about what that might be because they thought that the urban fringe matter would cover those things. And in terms of infrastructure and stormwater infrastructure, they've said, we thought we had sufficient capacity, but that was on the basis that the urban fringe matter was there and that was going to really take care of it. So now we're left with this what next? And the difficulty is that the council is actually the party that is in the best position to propose that what next, to do that analysis work that it is identified as needing to be undertaken, and to put that forward. In terms of the issue of that urban fringe matter still being on the table for determination, it puts the commissioners in somewhat of a difficult situation, because while the council has said they don't intend to call evidence on that, it's still open there for the submitters to do so. Now, Ms. Noakes sees defending that would have been the role of the council. It's not her intention to try and uphold that on a planning rationale basis, because that would have been something that needed to be led by council, but I don't know what other submitters would intend to do, and so I do think it is something that would need to be a determination on. But in terms of what fills that gap, we're suddenly looking at a much more truncated time to respond to that, and I do think it needs something to be that council does that analysis on first and puts up, because we're talking about, you know, on the urban fringe matter, there would have been sort of 9 months between lodging submissions to when things got to hearing, for parties that have an interest in that urban fringe matter to, you know, gather their thoughts, look at the submissions of other parties, collate their evidence. Trying to do that in terms of the, you know, several working days time frame that we look at between Section 42A reports, submitting evidence and hearing is a much harder thing. So I do have some concerns about that, and I also wanted to raise with you the idea that we can get ahead on the timing of this and by getting all of the planners to conference and come up with something. And I understand the rationale is to try and move things forward, to work in a very truncated time frame, but I think that's difficult, because I do see it as the role of the council in the planning process to put up a proposal for debate. And you know, I have concerns about that we send off a small group of submitters, those who have planners, those who have been involved in the strategic issues part of the hearing, to do that work, which really is something that the council needs to do, and is best placed to do that analysis in terms of qualifying matters and other constraints, because it has access to information that other parties don't or will rely on council to provide. So I don't think, just one other point I wanted to touch on is that I don't think there's any sort of issues with scope in terms of the council bringing in these what next qualifying matters that it's alluded to, because on an IPI there is that very broad scope to consider matters raised on submissions, but there is an issue of fairness in terms of the timeliness to be able to respond to that, which I think is challenging. I know there are ideas being floated about a variation on a variation, or publicising the change and indicating that late submissions would be welcome, but there's not really enough detail on those matters that have been sort of floated in conversations during the hearing over the last couple of days for me to be able to comment on those. So what has become a very simple, could we please have this further analysis that will be used to fill the gaps as quickly as possible, has become somewhat more complex. And I really just came here today to discuss that with you. So I'm happy to take questions or engage in a discussion on that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ms. Beresford. And of course, you're aware that we're having a procedural discussion next Friday, and I would anticipate that there will be some suggestions come forward from Waikato on the matters that you're talking about. We're certainly alive to that issue, and as you say, there is a fairness issue there, but I guess we're in a bit of a vacuum at the moment, because we don't know what's coming forward. Until we see what's coming forward, we don't know whether that issue of fairness is a consideration or not. So, as I say, I think we'll get some timetabling ideas next week. You would have heard that the panel's anticipating issuing a guidance note on the urban fringe issue, but that will be on that as a qualifying matter, not in terms of what happens next, of course. So yes, no, we're as I say, we're live to the concern that you're expressing. So we are aware from the section 42A that the proposition that the urban fringe issue has been used basically as a proxy for a raft of different reasons. And I think what you're indicating, which is fairly evident too, is that Ms Noakes has relied upon that for precisely the same reason. So, yeah. All right. Any questions?
Yes, just a couple, and then just really contextual to assist my understanding. In terms of Ms Noakes' property, do you have a rough idea of the size of that property? In terms of, I know you said it's a rural use, but I had a quick look on Google Maps, but wasn't able to see the...
Sorry, I don't actually have that to hand.
Okay. And do you know what it's currently used, rural, like what sort of rural use?
Yep, it's used for rural purposes, so it grazes a small amount of cattle.
Thank you.
You have any questions? All right. Well, thank you, Ms Beresford. Appreciate your submissions this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right. So. Ms Callaway and whoever else is, I understand that Niall Baker is unavailable. Ms Callaway, Ms Fisher is joining us, or who have we got? And Ms Sale, Margaret Sale, she's away until the 17th. Okay, well the 17th is today, I'm not sure who we've got. Morning.
Kia ora and good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Deborah Fisher, and I would like to read a joint statement on behalf of the Waikato Heritage Group, Niall Baker, Margaret Sale and myself. Following submissions, it was realised there was some commonality in what we were asking for, with the common point being character, so we are presenting as a group today. This opening statement is made on behalf of the Waikato Heritage Group and the other submitters listed in the appendix in respect of Hamilton City Council's proposed District Plan Change 12. The submitters will contend that A. Special character should be included as a qualifying matter in the plan change, providing for new special character areas to be identified in the Hamilton City District Plan. B. The special character areas currently identified in the Hamilton City District Plan should be retained as qualifying matters in the plan. C. The medium density residential standards should not apply to those areas. And D. The provisions that should apply are those set out in the evidence of Waikato Heritage Group submitter's witness, Ms Callaway. The submitters will contend that this outcome is consistent with and required by Part 2, and in particular Section 6F, 7B, 7F and 7G of the Act. The submitters will further contend that this outcome is required to A. Achieve a full, well-functioning urban environment as required by Objective 1 of the National Policy Statement Urban Development, and B. Avoid significant adverse effects in the environment and in particular on people in their communities, which will not be avoided or remedied and which will occur if the plan change does not contain the provisions sought by the submitters. Ms Callaway will be giving evidence for the Waikato Heritage Group in accordance with her statement of evidence in relation to character and heritage. Mr Niall Baker, who has planning qualifications and strategic planning experience, has provided evidence in relation to Hamilton City Council's response to the medium density residential standards and national policy statement on urban development and Part 2 of the Act. Other residents will be giving evidence of non-technical nature for the submitters on the particular characteristics of the affected character areas and the adverse effect on them and their communities should those areas not be included as a qualifying matter. With our submitter group, I will speak first, followed by Margaret Sale and then Laura Callaway as expert witness. I have lived in Hamilton for almost my whole life, and I have resided in a variety of neighbourhoods, including Frankton, Puketi, Claudelands and Fairview Downs, each with their own unique character. My evidence today focuses on provision for character as a qualifying matter. Character is not just about buildings and heritage. It's about a sense of place, belonging and community. It encompasses amenity factors like noise, sunlight, air quality, privacy and security, which in turn influence demand and price. While the RMA requires amenity to be protected, the MDRS removes all consideration of amenity and completely disregards the wishes and desires of thousands of Hamiltonians living in existing suburbs. Many in my community have expressed their thoughts and concerns by signing one or both of the petitions attached to my Plan Changes 9 and 12 submissions. The petitions were collected one after the other, with the first requesting the Fairview Downs be considered a historic heritage area under Plan Change 9. The second one requesting that special character zones be retained in Plan Change 12 and that Fairview Downs be given the status is if it is not designated as a historic heritage area under Plan Change 9. I spent a collective 3 weeks outside the Powers Road shops to collect these petitions. There was so much confusion in the community from the very beginning. There is a real muddle between Plan Change 9 and Plan Change 12 that local residents just can't understand. I had to explain to residents the 2 different plan changes that required 2 separate petitions requesting similar but different outcomes. Under Plan Change 12, the character chapter has been removed, except for Peacock area rules. But under Plan Change 9, historic heritage areas are being created. With 2 separate plan change processes going on, how do we ensure the outcomes we are seeking are achieved and things do not fall between the cracks? During the weeks I spent collecting the petitions, I heard many stories from long-term and second-generation residents and visitors, including the son of the previous owner of the house I've lived in for the last 24 years, a relative of the original owner behind me that was married on the property, a former classmate from primary school, and families who are still neighbours more than 50 years after building their homes. Many describe how the Fairview Downs neighbourhood grew, expanded and changed, but still retains its own unique charm and character. While it was not always easy, the overwhelming support I received from the community to protect our character and heritage is the reason I'm here today. This is evidenced by the petition of 90 people asking for our area to be included as a character area precinct overlay or whatever planning tool is the right one, and that was just one petition. A further petition relates to the historic heritage areas under Plan Change 9. Character can be included as an other matter under the qualifying matter legal framework. Waipā and other councils have done this. Special character zones must be retained in the Hamilton District Plan as a qualifying matter. The council should seriously listen to those communities requesting protection to ensure that it fulfills its obligations to the community it represents. Most communities are not opposed to intensification, with some 2-storey and unit complexes already blending in with the existing houses. However, the MDRS forces those that wish to stay to accept amenity losses that are life-changing when development happens around them, or sell and move themselves. And thus, the community is eventually lost to new development in history. Plan Change 12 and MDRS allow development to occur that is not in keeping with existing established neighbourhoods. It will, in some cases, literally replace these communities completely. It is possible to allow intensification and development in existing areas without completely losing the character of an area, as evidenced in the application of the current operative district plan. While it is commendable that Hamilton City Council is looking to transition current special character zones to historic heritage areas, removing special character zones from the district plan entirely fails to acknowledge the difference between heritage and character. Hamilton City Council acknowledged the importance of character to communities when it originally included special character zones in the district plan and emphasised the importance of maintaining character in the planning and development of Peacock. In conclusion, I want to emphasise there is a difference between character and heritage and a need to retain special character zones in the district plan. My community and I strongly believe that character matters in good urban planning, and we would like both heritage and character to be protected. Removing special character zones from the district plan entirely fails to acknowledge this difference or the community's wishes. Therefore, I urge the panel to seriously consider our request and retain special character zones in the district plan as qualifying matters to enable development that is in keeping with existing established neighbourhoods. I ask the panel to consider new areas such as Fairview Downs as a character area if it is not designated as a historic heritage area under Plan Change 9. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Fisher, and Sales, let's hear your submission, and then we'll have some questions. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. My name is Margaret Sale, and I represent the Frankton East Resident Group, which I believe you may have read our evidence and seen our 2 petitions.
Sure.
I am a registered nurse, and I have lived in Hamilton for 40 odd years with my family, and I also do voluntary work in the community. As community groups, we do not have the resources for lawyers and the planners, but our concerns are real and we seek them to be addressed for all of Hamilton. For many of us are concerned about the high density model that does not meet the existing community and ongoing requirements. Our community, Frankton, is an example of old single-storey houses, and we are an old established community with strong identity similar to other Hamilton suburbs. There is nowhere set aside in the proposed Hamilton District Plan for a character area, which we have requested. Character and heritage need separate folders in the district plan. Building a community with a character from scratch isn't the answer, and where is the originality in that? There has been poor communication, and the consultation undertaking of the intensification has been rather rushed. For example, Plan Change 12 was put before Plan Change 9, both ignoring our existing community characters. Community areas that I'm concerned about is the character of the area, be it 1960 or 1890 buildings that do not tick all the boxes to be a heritage icon. Concerns in regards to intensification. 1. Stronger rules set in standards, policies, and even a resource consent to apply to all dwellings 2 stories and higher, so that things are not improvised and are not made makeshift. 2. A walkable catchment that needs to be checked and defined. For example, the north side of Hamilton is not walkable. Major roading systems already disconnect communities like Frankton, and intensification will not improve this. For those that walk, the extension of the city zone will not go directly to essential services, for example, the police, the library, health services, etc. Intensify the existing city centre zone first. That is, See if high density is workable for both the population and the city planning unit in this already existing zone. If the number of faults with the model can be seen here, they are likely to apply across the city, such as walkability, not defined and has major issues. Lack of services in small suburban centres of Hamilton. Not a metropolitan city. Hamilton is not like Auckland with its serviced suburbs. Character overlay is not included, but for many years we have had this already. Summary. The impact of intensification will be extreme in our lives. Height reduction is needed to reduce the proposed up to 6-storey blocks to be built in our suburb from next year. Character overlay needed in the district plan to modify the degree of change. Finally, we request that character in Hamilton be a qualifying matter. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Sales. Did you want to introduce Ms. Callaway at the same time now, or?
I think Laura was planning on. Yeah.
All right, okay, all right. Questions? No?
No, I might wait for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear what you're seeking, and we're going to have to make a determination, obviously, with respect to character and how that fits with the constraints of the legislation that we're dealing with. And I mean, you're well aware of that, obviously, in terms of the detail that you put in your submission. So thank you, for that. And you can be assured that we will look at that issue very carefully in terms of whether or not, we can, in actual fact, introduce it as a QM or not.
I guess I find it unusual why some councils have it in and some councils have it out, and it certainly just seems to be a choice of whoever is making the decision, which doesn't really seem very fair.
Well, I mean, we'll obviously run a consistent rule across the 3 councils in terms of how we determine that to fall, and obviously on the evidence of the particular areas that you're going to bring forward to us in the substantive hearing for this matter. So thank you very much for your submissions, and yes, we will see you again.
Thank you.
Yeah. Ms. Callaway.
Kia ora.
Thank you.
I'm sure you're wanting a coffee break about now.
You're going to take us to the coffee break.
Oh, good. That's very good to know.
Right.
Thank you.
And I mean, just, in anticipation, we will probably make the same comment to you as I've just made just now, because you're raising, legitimately raising the same issue and obviously in much more detail. But yeah, but anyway, present yourself.
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Laura Callaway. I am a registered architect and a heritage consultant based in the Waikato. My river is the Waitawhiriwhiri River, which enters the mighty Waikato, and my mountain is Purongia. I am representing the Waikato Heritage Group, which is a group that is interested in the Waikato community in particular in terms of historic heritage, and includes historians, planners, retired architects and members of the community. I've been involved extensively in historic heritage for probably far too many years, and that includes looking at historic heritage areas, particularly in the Waikato and further afield. The evidence that I've provided in my statement, I'm sure you have read, thank you very much. It focuses on strategy for character and historic heritage, which includes the sense of place and identity. It speaks to unintended consequences of the proposed changes to character and potentially historic heritage by progressing Plan Change 12 ahead of Plan Change 9 in regards to the Hamilton City environment. It looks to character as an other qualifying matter, which is consistent with the requests of the Waikato Heritage Group and other lay submissions, and also the consistency of approach to character across the councils, so that there is a regional approach and hopefully a national one as well, although that's not within the scope of what I'm talking about. So Hamilton, as part of the Waikato, has its own very distinctive character, with existing character areas that the community identifies with and have been long established and actually hard fought for. Both character and historic heritage has regional importance. That's why it makes it very important to have an overall strategy in terms of historic heritage and character, in my view. There's an interrelationship between character and historic heritage. It needs careful, sustainable management, and both are finite resources. Both can provide a modifier in periods of rapid growth and ensure identity and place markers are retained, something that's going to be very important in my view. An integrated regional approach to retaining character and build heritage as part of a well-functioning urban environment is in line with the approaches of the Acts and the operative district plans of the region. Retaining character and identity along with modifying, particularly by reducing heights, is particularly relevant in a city that is domestically scaled, as it is in the Waikato's small towns, as acknowledged by Waipā District Council this week. Character has been addressed by Waipā District Council to modify the impacts of the Amendment Act and the MPSUD. In regards Hamilton City Council PC9, its long overdue significant citywide review of the city's historic heritage and its strategy, which includes regional historic heritage. This has been some 25 years in the making, so this is not, in the case of Hamilton, a council that's been able to actually have that undertaking of looking at the city as a whole, and it's why you see submitters concerned. PC9 is not a plan change inclusive of character. In fact, what did actually take place is that in about the 3 or 4 week gap between PC9 being notified to the community and then PC12, is that when a submitter, potential submitter, asked what was happening with character, the council couldn't actually say anything because at that time it wasn't what was being put up. A few weeks later, of course, that changed. Historic heritage, including substantial new policies and rules, have been consequently split across the two PCs. In addition, there's also proposed historic heritage areas in Hamilton that are both in residential zones, and there's one in a commercial zone where housing intensification is, and this again is something that's been split across the two plan changes.
Sorry,
Yes.
could you
Yes.
just repeat what you just said? I
Yes.
lost it with that.
Sorry, yes.
that-
So in addition to the proposed, in addition, so in the proposed Hamilton City Council PC9, historic heritage areas include both a residential zone and also a commercial zone, where housing intensification is of course included. But this has been split across the district plan, so there's a very new discussion of having a proposed historic heritage area in a commercial zone that hasn't been discussed before. So there's a complication across this approach. Best practice would be to progress PC9 in an integrated approach, as I'm sure the council would hope to do originally. It's been a long time in the coming, at least 3 years that I'm aware of. But it should also have included character, I would suggest. From the PC hearing this week, Mr Muldaney noted that identifying qualifying matters was not exclusive to the council. I think this allows for character to be considered as a qualifying matter. There is explicit provision for other matters to be included. Character can also potentially fall as a Section 6 matter of national importance, as character can have historic elements and in many cases does. For instance, the existing character zones in the chapter for Hamilton City Council is primarily historic heritage-based character zones. There are other types within that chapter, but this is the case with Hamilton. This means that it could be treated under the defined qualifying matter for heritage, but further assessment is required. This would support community submissions requesting existing character areas be considered and potentially new areas included. Evidence of the range of submitters shows that both for and against, there is concern over character, existing and proposed, and requests to retain. At Tuesday's hearings, it was noted that Policy 3 under the NPSUD, which focuses primarily, it's my understanding, on density, is one of the policies and does not have a higher weight potentially than other policies. This would be very helpful in terms of looking at achieving a well-functioning urban environment as required by Objective 1 of the NPSUD. Character is part of a well-functioning urban environment and an important urban design element retaining sense of identity. Amenity values are still relevant under Section 7 of the RMA and are part of sustainably managing the environment, along with avoiding significant adverse effects on the environment, which of course include people and communities. Reducing the impact of high density is important on existing communities. Mr. Muldowney noted concerns in regards to sequencing and the need for integration of PC9 and PC12 for Hamilton City Council in terms of the HHAs. This is supported as integration and sequencing is important, although it would have been best practice if PC9 had been progressed with first, in my view. However, in terms of the comment that was made, in terms of the sequencing and integration scope, I would suggest that character also needs to be included to address the existing character areas and the proposed new character areas. Day 1 evidence from Waipā District Council on the topic of character as a qualifying matter has been addressed and consulted on with the community. However, this has not been the strategy in Hamilton. Retaining existing character is clear in the submissions in both Waipā and in Hamilton. Aligning the other qualifying matters gives the opportunity for a consistency of approach to a character across the Waikato. Would be an improved strategy and work towards retaining sense of identity and the character of the Waikato suburbs and towns, which is currently undefined, when assessing the effects and progressing a well-functioning environment as per Objective 1. Addressing historic heritage areas as a specific topic in PC12, as recommended by Mr. Muldowney, is supported and will go a long way to allow for further discussion between the parties. However, it asks that character could be included as an associated component with historic heritage areas. And if urban design is to be also a specific topic, both character and historic heritage should be addressed within this topic because there's a strong interrelationship in my view. In my evidence, I've provided 3 appendix to the back of my evidence, which I know you have. Yeah. Sorry, it was rather large and probably an awful lot to read in addition to all your other reading that you had to do. And Appendix 1 is a sample of a Section 32 report for the qualifying matter of character, which was put together just as a preliminary example that using the existing documentation that Hamilton City Council has been working on in when they did a character review earlier on, that there is a progression to be able to use existing special character zone documents which apply in the operative district plan, along with the Hamilton City Council review of existing character, which of course wasn't included in PC 12. Appendix 2 is a sample of just some of the submissions on characters and areas, which I quickly compiled together to show the different range of concerns and the mixed submissions there are between PC9 and PC12 because of the primarily timing and consultation, in my view. And Appendix 3, I appended the Hamilton City Council review of existing character areas, which was prepared by Lifescapes as a final report in 2022. I think I've got the right version for PC 12. And this was brought to light when looking at PC 9 as a background document. It speaks to the existing 4 historic character areas, overlay, and the proposed historic heritage areas as they were at that point in time, and included site-specific surveying. So this is a much finer grain of detail that's been provided, which may assist in reducing time and effort and other such factors going into looking at character. The strategy for historic heritage and character requires, in my view, a higher level of strategy and detail than provided in the Hamilton City Council proposal. Both should be based on modern reviews that are comprehensive, and there should be consistency across councils that, of course, is appropriate to the circumstances. Character is the critical element of retaining a sense of identity, and that the significant changes that are proposed in the intensification, which is, of course, in PC 12, and as has been sort of discussed in Waipā, it requires a finer graining of investigation and analysis, particularly in PC 12. Character as a qualifying matter can be used to modify the scale and the effects of PC 12 to an appropriate level, in my view, and provide for housing in a way that protects special character values in Hamilton and in the region. Sorry, my notes ended up being sort of a little bit too extensive. I'm quite happy to provide this to Steve. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. I'll welcome any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Callaway. And thank you for your submission, very comprehensive. Just on that, on the last point on that Appendix 3 from Lifescapes, which March 2021 final report is the version that we've got in front of us.
Thank you.
What actually happened to that? There's a series of recommendations in there. Do you know what happened to those recommendations?
Well, in my view, having also been addressing PC 9, it perhaps fell between the cracks. So I think there was a strong desire to progress historic heritage areas, and that happened, of course, in the difficult times of the last year or so, and in the rush to complete that, to put forward to the community, and again in a hurry, that was actually, I suspect, lost. Because in my view,
just stop you there. That's your assumption, is it?
That's my assumption.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. Right. No, that's good. Questions? Nigel? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Callaway. I mean, obviously, we've got at least 2 more fairly large opportunities to consider this matter after this initial look at scope and where we go to from here. So, and I must admit, I haven't looked at the appendices that you've attached here in any detail. What's the sort of the extent of the areas that we're talking about? Are these sort of broad scale on a sort of sub-suburban level? Sort of Frankton East, and these other areas. I mean, are we talking about the whole sort of area being included as special character, or does the analysis result on a site-by-site basis, as it has to be? Does it result in sort of like identifying sort of smaller areas where character is more prominent?
I think it's probably a combination of all of the above. It's quite complex because there's only a few existing character zones in Hamilton, which of course happen to be towards the inner city of both sides of the river. There are proposed historic heritage areas that have come out of further discussion, which include those existing ones being primarily turned into historic heritage areas, but within that are also potentially character areas where the boundaries have been moved and changed, and smaller clusters. So there's quite a mix. And then of course there's an additional, I think it's 28 proposed historic heritage areas that are also embedded and proposed in PC 9. It's quite a complex situation. It's distinctively different in my view from what you have in Auckland and Wellington, because there has been this lack of addressing in a citywide approach both character and historic heritage. So that's my view.
So will the group, is it intended that the group bring forward detailed propositions at the substantive
Yes,
hearing?
that's correct, yes.
I mean, yeah. So, what's the basis of the character that you would say is represented in those suburbs?
The character is probably what I'd term working class. That they're ordinary places. But for example, those same ordinary places, such as Hayes Paddock and the Railway Village, which of course are large examples of low-cost community housing to a degree. This makes up the character of Hamilton, and I think it's why it's difficult when you're addressing what character is and historic heritage to sort of have a picture that's comprehensive, particularly when going into Plan Change 12. So you've got 250 odd houses in Hayes Paddock, which is nationally significant, but currently character zone. You've got around about 100 houses, and in the railway settlement, which again is nationally significant. So Hamilton does have, in my view, quite a distinctive character, and because it's a city that was developed after 1945, it also has a number of interesting groupings, community groupings of, again, sort of state and community housing, and also that first surge, which of course Auckland has as well, of just ordinary homes, but now 50 years on have a very distinctive pattern, in my view, and community identity.
Oh, well, no doubt we'll be getting into the detail of that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Just hang on a second. So, I mean, there are two parts to what you're going to be bringing forward. If I may have over-characterised this, but is one that you're looking for the existing special characters, the four special character zones to be brought forward as an existing qualifying matter, and then there's a lot of other areas that you want to identify. Is that how that's going to work? I just want to get a sense of the scale that we're talking about in terms of the coming hearings.
Yes. So I suppose it's a high-level strategy that character still exists, and that may include the zones that do not progress from the existing character zones into historic heritage areas. But there is also this vacuum in the process between PC9 and PC12, where the community have also identified either character areas potentially or historic heritage areas, and so it's a combination.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
We look forward to hearing later.
Thank you.
On those matters. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that's the close of the submission part of this round one of hearings. Do you want to address anything in particular, any of council?
Probably just the topic of where to from here.
The small topic of where to
topic
here.
of what next.
Yeah.
Obviously, the intention now is to work towards a detailed conversation about all of that next Friday with the panel. There's, I think, amongst each of the councils, there's a memorandum or some form of straw man proposal starting to take shape. The intention is, I think, to get that circulated and available to the panel by around midweek next week, so that everyone's had an opportunity to absorb what is being suggested, and then come armed on Friday with suggestions and solutions and so on. So that's the program in a broad sense. There is, of course, I think at this point, going to be a separation of paths, so to speak, from each of the councils. There's a couple of areas that are continuing to intersect. There's one particular scope issue, which is the inclusionary zoning scope question that was common to all of the councils, and just conscious of the fact that you're addressing scope on the Waipā matters ahead of the other councils, but that feels like one that Hamilton and Waikato might need to just jump on board with the earlier conversation, because that's just the reality with the intersection of those issues. The alternative is that we don't, and we leave it and have some second determination on the same issue without having the opportunity to contribute to the first, and that doesn't feel good. So we're just working through those sorts of issues, and as I say, the idea is that we'll have something circulated by midway through next week that everyone can get their teeth into.
That would be very helpful, and not so much of a straw man. I take it since the objective of a straw man is to burn it. So.
Yeah, well, we'll see if we can do something better than that. But certainly it'll be a starting point which should anchor a discussion on the Friday.
So can I just in terms of things you're covering off, so can I just query that? Obviously there's a scope and a timetabling issue on that one. There have been numbers of propositions with respect to mediation that I think really is conferencing, because of course we need conferencing ahead of mediation, because otherwise you won't have a text that's generally agreed to mediate, basically. So there's some topic areas there that would be very, very helpful to have those sort of identified. And yes, then there are a couple of very, very specific issues, aren't there? You know, as you say, with respect to matters that we need to advance ahead of Waipā getting going in whenever it is April that we start off. So yeah, steers on all of those matters would be really helpful to the panel.
That's the intention. Yes.
Yeah, that'd be really good. And I mean, we're open at this stage, depending on how quickly that comes together and can be circulated, and if possible, any sort of initial responses as to whether or not we need to be in person or virtually on Friday. At this stage, my preference for us anyway would be that we do it in person, but we may be at a point where we don't need to do that because there's general agreement on direction. But let's signal at the moment it will be in person from the panel anyway, and then we'll see where we get to next week.
Thank you.
So that's all very helpful. Is there any other matters before we close? Yes, Bridget. Interim guidance. Yeah.
I'm just wondering what you're intending by that. I think what Council will be proposing in its memorandum, which is also circulated to be part of the funds, is that there is an early recommendation from the panel on that issue. As it's a recommendation, Council's very keen to put it to bed so that the Council would then make a decision on your recommendation in advance of the substantive hearing. Was that the interim guidance you were thinking about, or was it something different to that?
I guess until it was written, we're not really sure. I wasn't anticipating that we would go so far as to have a categorical determination on it, and therefore a positive recommendation. But I mean, we can certainly discuss that. There was more, I think, more tending at this point in time, and let's talk about that next week. This time was really to capture where we've got to on the issue in terms of the submissions that we've heard on it, to indicate that anybody who in actual fact wants to pursue that issue, if that issue is still live, it's got a bit of an uphill task to do that, and they will need to actually justify the positions and so on. So I mean, I guess there are two ways we could go if we have a brief to live next week, as to whether or not we can make a finding on that and therefore a positive recommendation, or whether it's the caution that we would be issuing. As I say, currently my view is that it's more likely to be a caution than a finding on it, because it's been a selective hearing on the issue at this point in time, and there may well be other parties out there who are not engaged, who still wish to make representation on it. So I mean, if Council in its memo wants to be more definitive, that's fine. Yeah.
Thank you.
So nothing else, we'll close the hearing for the moment, and look forward to seeing those of you who are going to be here. No, well, not here, but in the reception lounge, I understand it, next Friday starting at 10:30, and we'll, as I say, at this stage, we'll come down for the day. Right, thank you very much.
Thanks, sir.
And travel safely, everybody.